Ministries are protected by the First Amendment's free exercise clause and the free speech clause. And yet, in the city of Corona, California, there's a man who is being criminally prosecuted. In fact, he's been convicted because he was preaching in a public park. And we're going to talk about that case in the second half of this show. You're definitely going to want to listen to this and where it stands right now. But the first half of the program, I want to share with you some exciting things that are taking place as Pacific Justice Institute expands its ministry well outside the state of California. As many of you know, we have affiliate attorneys all over the United States representing people without charge. And we've been doing this now for over 20 years. But what we've noticed is the fact that when we have a full-time attorney or attorney who's on the ground actually there on a constant basis in a city, that there's more confidence in that city with regard to the body of Christ and ministries and churches because they know there's someone there to cover their back. That's what we do, and that's what we want to do more and more. Many of you know we just recently opened an office in the state of Oregon, Salem, Oregon, and which is a state capital. Our attorney, Ray Hackey, is the full-time attorney there, taking on cases, defending religious freedom, parental rights, sanctity of human life. But we also opened an office recently in Seattle, Washington. This is a very important strategic state as well because it's very oppressive with regards to religious freedom, parental rights, basic worldview of Christianity that we have, that we hold so dear, is under attack so much in the state of Washington. So we opened an office there, and recently I visited the state of Washington, and I was very pleased with the reception we received. First off, I was blessed to be able to speak at 2 different churches. And I'll be honest with you. Sometimes when I speak in a church, I'm thinking like, especially if it's not on a Sunday morning, I'm thinking there's not going to be a lot of people there. But there were a lot of people at these churches. They were both Ukrainian churches there in the Seattle area. And they were very encouraging. And many signed up to get our case updates and to keep up with what we're doing. It's so important because whether it's financially supporting Pacific Justice or prayerfully supporting Pacific Justice, both are very much appreciated. We also were able to address a group of business owners there in the state of Washington, small group of Christian business owners, and it's a wonderful ministry. Well, after I was done addressing them and trying to encourage them about faith in the workplace and how people can legally evangelize the workplace, and some of my testimony, they decided to actually have me come back to put on a full 45-minute presentation for their annual conference in October. We're very excited about that, and it's going to allow us to hopefully empower a lot of business owners throughout that Seattle area on how they can live their faith for Christ in the workplace. But one of the more exciting times of the trip was when I actually visited the state legislature. In fact, specifically, Representative Matt Shea. Now, Matt Shea represents the constituency of Spokane, Washington, in eastern Washington. It's a more conservative part of Washington, if you will. And he is very open about his convictions, and he also happens to be one of our affiliate attorneys. So I was able to visit with him, and while I was visiting with him, he said, Brad, hey, why don't I take you into the caucus that we're having, a large group of legislators, and I'll let you address them and tell them what Pacific Justice is doing here in the state of Washington and what your new office is doing and why you're here. So I said, of course, sure, I'd be happy to. And sure enough, in a room packed with legislators there in the state of Washington, I was given the privilege to be able to address them. Now, we have with us on the line Representative Matt Shea, and thank you so much for joining us, Representative Shea.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Now, I appreciate the time you've given us. I also was very appreciative of the time you allowed me to have to address a number of the legislators there during a caucus meeting, so thank you very much. I was very encouraged by their positive support of us opening an office there in Washington State. But tell the audience, if you can, some of the challenges with regard to religious freedom and parental rights that we're facing there in the state of Washington.
Well, Washington State really is on the front line of this battle. whether we're talking parental rights in regards to vaccinations or what is put into your child's body, because it's not really about the efficacy of vaccines. It's about the right of a parent to choose the healthcare decisions and decide the healthcare decisions for their kids. And so we're seeing that as kind of a battle across the board. And this idea that parents shouldn't control the decision making for their children on everything from schools to, like I just said, vaccines. One of the other things that's interesting is that we've had quite a push too in regards to trying to do full funding of abortion across the board and really take money from taxpayers who conscientiously object to that and apply it to something that obviously is abhorrent. And so we're seeing those types of approaches, in addition to what I have very clearly said several times is the general anti-Christian sentiment. It's the worst I've ever seen actually here in Olympia, particularly on issues like free speech as well and the ability to express yourself. They say now that anything that is disagreement is intolerance on the part of those that are believers. So those are the things that we're seeing this year. Those are the things that have been kind of brewing for a few years, but really we're seeing a hard push against religious liberty in the state. And this is despite the fact that Article 1, Section 11 of the Washington State Constitution says that there's an absolute freedom of conscience in all matters of religious sentiment, and Article 26 said there should be perfect toleration of religious sentiment.
Yeah, I wish they took that seriously, but yet we at Pacific Justice Institute will take it very seriously in court as needed moving forward. Those areas you just described, Representative Shea, I think are all very important when it comes to freedom and liberty, and yet we see that as a real growing problem. Now, there's some legislation that's pending right now. What are some bills that people should be aware of, not only in the state of Washington, but aware of just for the fact that it may be coming to a state near them if this passes in Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several. It'll take different forms in the respective states, but one of them has to do with, as they call it, comprehensive sexual education, and we were able to kill that bill for this year. But effectively, it allows pornography into the classroom, and a lot of parents don't even know that this is happening. It allows teachers to bring in outside third-party materials, and also it is not. They try to say it's age appropriate, but when you look at what the definition of age appropriate is, it really does not fit, and the curriculum itself does not fit. Where you have 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds having to demonstrate knowledge of certain things that I think both you and I would consider pornographic. Another one is the creation of a LGBTQ commission whose sole agenda is to promote and require private businesses to promote the LGBTQ agenda. And so those are two that we're going to see go around the country to various states, and there's a couple more as well.
Yeah, it's a growing action of intimidation. Before, the issue was one of LGBT rights. Now it's one of LGBT dominance and intolerance and silencing of anyone, including the private sector, who don't agree with their agenda and their values and their worldview or their religion, if you will. So I think this is very serious, and I know we at Pacific Justice Institute are standing ready to defend the rights of business owners, whether it's a bakery or whatever the business, not to have to compromise their faith and conviction. But ideally, we'd just like to see this not to become law in the first place.
Right, and we just need to see the Constitution upheld. And to give a few examples to your listeners out of Washington State of this kind of intimidation, one was when the R-74 campaign was here, as Referendum 74, there was a same-sex marriage bill passed, and there was a referendum filed to bring it to a vote of the people. Well, the list of all the petition signers, every name on that list that signed that petition to put it to a vote of the people was then released publicly. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court upheld that releasing of those people, but they did it with the stated intent of then going to those folks' employers, going to their neighbors, going to their friends, going to their business partners, everything, and intimidating them.
Yeah, and that was their purpose and intent, and that's what they were doing. That's extremely alarming because who's going to want to sign a petition if they know that they could lose their job later on because of it? Where's the privacy here? I mean, it's like having to disclose who you vote for on election day. We don't have that. Otherwise, we have intimidation, and that's what you have now in Washington State because of that.
Well, the Founding Fathers had the Federalist Papers and wrote under Publius for this exact reason. And just yesterday, Friday, I was contacted, and in Washington State, people that have turned in their bump stocks, there was a ban on bump stocks put in Washington, and people that turn them in, even if they turned them in to a friend, their name and their personally identifying information, including their address and phone number, are going to be released to a third party who has said in the public records request, said that they wanted to use that to create a map of where these dangerous people are. I mean, imagine that. You're a private citizen. They've asked you to turn the bump stock in. You comply with the law. And now they're weaponizing it so that they can intimidate those folks and label them as dangerous persons, even though they may not be.
Yeah, it just assumes that gun owners are dangerous people. I think the Second Amendment has something to say about that and the danger we have when government tries to go down that road. Well, Matt, I really appreciate you. I know you have actually been an affiliate attorney of the Pacific Justice Institute, and you're working hard there in the state legislature there in Washington State. Is there any last words you have for what people need to do to help change things in states like Washington?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen a rash of cases of people being fired for their religious beliefs, and that has been overtly stated here in Washington State, but I suspect it's happening in other states. And it's important to understand this, that if you see that happening to your neighbor, you need to stand up for your neighbor and not just say, oh, well, I'm glad that didn't happen to me. It's going to eventually happen to all of us if we don't stand up together now. And that's really why I appreciate Pacific Justice Institute, because you guys do stand up, you show up, and you win. And that's an awesome combination.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the work that you're doing as well. And through our office there in the state of Washington, we look forward to working with the people there, including those there in the state capitol who have take to heart the Constitution and the fundamental rights like religious freedom and parental rights, free speech that we all appreciate so much. Thank you again for your time, and keep up your great work.
Thank you, Brad. Keep up the fight. All right.
Thank you.
Well, I have a passion, I guess, to share with those who don't know the Lord because somebody loved me enough to share with me. And where would I be if they hadn't been willing to put up with my prickliness?
And I've known Iris ever since I got here, and I love her Bible study. She's a very good teacher. She teaches the Word of God.
I was just wandering around on a Saturday afternoon looking for something to do, and I heard some people talking, and I went over to the lounge and they were having a Bible study.
It was like connecting all the dots. Artist would tell us a story and then find it in the Bible, and it seemed to make such common sense.
She'd take a topic and we discuss the topic at its various levels and try to make sense of that topic.
He was arguing with artists and more with artists than me about accepting the Lord, and he was a skeptic and I don't know just what all. But then one day he had an accident downstairs and he fell down and I don't know, it broke his hip or something. She was talking about get off the fence. Well, he said, I jumped the fence. And he did. He jumped the fence and asked the Lord in his life. And we'd been working with him I would have gave up. Artist is more persistent. I have to hand it to her.
I was stripped of chaplaincy, of being a volunteer, of being able to teach the Bible study, and of my TV program. One of the accusations is that I was rude. I'm not rude by nature. I am sure that God wants me to ask you where you're going to go, but that's not up to me. We are all under a death penalty because we have broken God's laws. God put me in the business of helping people find Him. This is a very special place that talks about the cost of freedom. It's not free. We have to continuously understand that if we want to be free, if we want to exercise our God-given rights and our constitutional rights, it's going to cost us. And that's probably why I fight. Because as a Jew, I knew that Yeshua, Jesus, was not a subject, and it was going to cost me everything. Maybe not my life, but everything that I counted important in my life.
Artist Bro is one of the most vivacious great-grandmas that you're ever likely to meet. She's full of life. She's a light in a dark place, and in a place where that vivacity, that spirit is so desperately needed. And sadly, the Veterans Home is pursuing her precisely because of that reason, because she's the type of person who has strong beliefs and isn't afraid to say them. She's the kind of person who will stand up for herself and stand up for other people as well.
Artist is a woman who just loves the Lord, and she wants us to share her faith, the hope that's within her. These veterans at this home, they sacrificed so this Bible study could happen. All veterans deserve to be protected, to not have to relinquish their constitutional rights that they work so hard and sacrifice so much to defend. That's why we can't let this go by. We all need to stand up. We all need to say enough is enough, and it's okay to share her faith, to share the good news at that home. If you'd like to support the Pacific Justice Institute on either a one-time or a monthly basis, we greatly appreciate that. Just go to our website, pacificjustice.org, pacificjustice.org, or pji.org, P for Pacific, J for Justice, I for Institute.org, pji.org. And there you can sign up also to receive our regular weekly update. It's called our Legal Insider. It keeps you informed of what's going on with regard to our cases, our victories, successes, challenges. We greatly appreciate people being aware of what's taking place so they can also pray for us and intercede for those many attorneys out there taking on these cases for the Pacific Justice Institute and the many people we represent. Also, we have other great resources as well. Once again, it's pacificjustice.org or pji.org. Check it out. Now, we have with us in studio one of our staff attorneys, Michael Peffer. He heads up our Southern California office. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brad. Nice being here.
Now, you, Michael, have been engaged in a very important case involving a man who is being criminally prosecuted for preaching in a public place, a public park. Tell us about this case.
Yes, Brad, and this falls into the category that PGI helps folks, whether it's a huge case or whether it's a small case. There's an important issue of law here, but a relatively minor, if you will, some might say minor. It's not minor to our client. who has, for over a decade, been going to a public park in the city of Corona and preaching the gospel. And because the park is rather sizable, he uses a bullhorn in order to preach his message. And at one point, he was doing so in the way he has done for over a decade. And the police came and gave him a ticket for preaching without using a bullhorn without a permit.
Using a bullhorn without a permit. I haven't heard of that before, where you're limited on your speech in a public place simply because you're using a bullhorn. Was there any rational basis for this that was given, and anything that actually supports it legally?
Well, the officer said that there was a complaint about excessive noise. This is not a heavily residential area. Again, he's in a public park. Municipalities have noise ordinances, and they are becoming more and more in favor, largely because they don't really have a leg to stand on when it comes to pure free speech issues. So let's say, well, we're going to condition your usage on the fact that you're not making too much noise. And we have dealt with this on other occasions, PJI has, and the issue is, listen, you can't simply say, hey, you don't get to use a bullhorn or some other sort of source of amplification unless you get a permit. Right. And wink, wink, nobody gets this permit. And that's exactly what the police officer testified to when we went to trial on this case.
So in the past, no one has gotten this permit. People have preached with a bullhorn or spoken with a bullhorn in the past. But for some reason, they decided to lay down this law on him, to apply it just to him, seemingly. And that's problematic on its face, because if you have a law that's even if it's neutral on its face, but it's prejudicial in its application, that's unconstitutional.
You're right.
And so that's what we're looking at here. Now, they didn't back down. You stepped up on behalf of Pacific Justice Institute to defend him. This went to trial. What happened at trial?
Well, we went to trial, and our client testified, and as did the police officer who gave the ticket. And it's pretty straightforward. It's an infraction, so it goes before a lower court, but nonetheless in the superior court, who has the power to sanction our client. And the officer testified, and this is key for our purposes, is the officer testified, I asked him, how did you know that he didn't have a permit? He said, well, because nobody gets a permit to do this in the city. So what that gives to us is a reason to defend this, and that is, you can't simply outlaw speech because it's going through a bullhorn and say, oh, too bad, you got to get a permit, and we don't give permits. That's far more speech than is necessary to accomplish their stated goals.
Right. Now, they are allowed to have some restrictions on noise levels.
That's
obviously.
Right.
I mean, even though it's in a public park, was there anything measurable? Did they have any kind of measuring device that was utilized to say, well, you went way past the noise levels?
No, there wasn't. I think that's a good point for our purpose, is that the police officer simply testified, I could hear you from 1,000 feet away. But our client says that his bullhorn is not a powerful bullhorn, and there's no way anybody could hear for 1,000 feet away. But at any rate, the officer simply says, hey, I don't need to do a measurement here. And that's the problem here, is the statute needs to point out the decibels, the measurements, right, how he determines this. He doesn't just get them to say, well, because I say it's illegal.
It opens the door to too much subjective assessment. If a police officer doesn't like what he's hearing, they say, okay, yeah, that's too loud.
Right.
If he likes what he's hearing, perhaps it's of a different faith or a different ideology or a different worldview, you say, oh, that's okay, that's allowed. That's right. And then the fact that it's being implemented against him, but in the past it hasn't been, that's very alarming as well. So I know, I don't condemn the town of Corona, California. They've got some great churches there. I've guest preached in at least one or two churches there in Corona in the past. But nonetheless, if we allow this just to to go this decision to stand against this man and his desire to preach the good news of Jesus, it could send a loud signal of approval of other cities to do the same, and that's a real concern. Moving forward on this, where are we at now?
Well, last week we filed an appeal. We had filed a notice to appeal it some months ago. And last week we actually served our opening brief on the city. And we intended to defend this man, our client, against this overreaching police officer, guided by an overreaching statute.
Yeah.
Again, we support law enforcement, and
that's right.
Frankly, we need more of them in our society, but we don't need them taking an arbitrary statute, making an arbitrary decision about the fact that his speech is not allowed here.
Right. You know, I'm willing to bet if this had been someone else with a different message, say it was some children having a birthday party, and they had a bullhorn, a parent had a bullhorn saying, kids, time to eat or time to come to the whatever, there would have been no arrest. There would have been no prosecution. It's because of the messaging. I believe that is really clear here, and I think that's why it's so important that we defend people like him. I know I personally had a case similar to this, actually, in San Antonio, Texas. Mm-hmm. A man was out there in a public place, downtown, public sidewalk, preaching, using a bullhorn, and it didn't violate the noise ordinances, but yet they were still going to prosecute him. They did not want him to preach the gospel. We stepped up. I flew out there to defend him. They dropped the charges the morning that the case was supposed to be heard. We were all ready to defend him in criminal court. He was going to be, if he was convicted, he would have had up to a year behind bars.
Wow. Yeah.
For one thing, preaching the good news of Jesus Christ in a public place.
That's right.
And that's why this is so important. We've had these cases all over the country. And folks, if you're listening to this broadcast right now, and you know of someone who has preached the gospel and they've been harassed by law enforcement, or perhaps you yourselves have decided that you want to engage in public ministry in a constructive, a loving, clear way, biblical way, and yet you have doubts about this, go to our website. It's pacificjustice.org or pji.org. And there we have a resource all about your rights to publicly evangelize, to share the good news of Christ in public places. And by the way, if you ever have problems because of this, face reprisal or threats, contact us. Contact Pacific Justice Institute. That's what we're here to do, to defend people like this gentleman without charge. We pick up all the costs, all the expenses. We do all the work without charge all across the United States. Pacific Justice Institute, Michael, we're all about empowering and equipping people for ministry at home, in their schools, their workplace, and public places. And we want faith to thrive in this country. And I'm very grateful to the work that you're doing in cases like this to make that happen. I mean, we have states like California, Oregon, Washington, other states, in the Northeast and other places that are known for being very hostile towards people of faith. Yeah. But we also have cities in the South that have, like San Antonio and El Paso, to name a few, that have had reprisals against people of faith as well. And wherever you may be, contact us at Pacific Justice Institute. We're here to help. We're here to represent you. And in so doing, defend and represent the freedoms and liberty of all Americans as well. Michael, thank you so much for what you're doing, and keep up the great work.
My pleasure, Brad. Thanks for having me.
So, folks, there you have it. It's our God-given freedoms we're talking about. Now, let's choose to keep them. I'm Brad Dacus, president of Pacific Justice Institute. Have a great weekend.